topic tonight is 4 things we should do right now to address our affordable housing crisis. This forum will be followed by a session on the related issue of homelessness in November. For tonight, we've assembled a very knowledgeable panel who bring a variety of perspectives to tonight's topic. Jim Frank is a longtime resident of Spokane and founder of Greenstone, a regional urban development and home building company. He has 30 years of experience in home building and advocacy for affordable housing. Spokane City Council member Candace Mung is serving her 2nd term representing Council District number 3. She has an extensive history of working to improve the city's business districts, parks, and neighborhoods. She was twice elected president of the city's Plan Commission, which helped create the city's first comprehensive plan that focuses growth in business centers and corridors. Chaz Bates works as a senior planner for the city of Spokane Valley. He has 20 years of planning experience. He assists with the city's long-range planning efforts and recently managed the development of the city's first housing action plan. Amber Waldorf has long been involved in a variety of community development and leadership roles. As a twice elected city council member, she's led efforts to expand Spokane's public transit, oversaw major city investments to reduce pollution in the Spokane River, and spearheaded policies to address the impacts of housing foreclosure. Currently, she is director of the Zone at Northeast Community Center, working to improve education, economic and health equity, build neighborhood leadership, and support thriving families and schools. First, we'll start with our panelists each making a short presentation. We'll follow that with discussion and questions from the audience. Jim, we'll start with you. You have the floor.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about a very important subject and appreciate the effort that Peg has made to expose this issue to the public. So I have been working in housing for the past 30 years, housing on the private sector market side. And we've spent a lot of time working with nonprofits over that 30-year period. And in particular, I'm retired, semi-retired from Greenstone now. So the last few years, I've spent an increasing amount of time working with nonprofit housing providers and affordable housing advocacy work. I think we're all pretty aware of the housing problems that we have in Spokane, but there are just a few things that I'd like to highlight. We've seen, obviously everyone sees the housing price increases that are occurring in Spokane. Rental prices are up. In fact, this last year, rental prices increased in Spokane about 35%. We're in a regional market. Spokane, Coeur d'Alene metropolitan area, it's about 750,000 people now. And we have an urban growth boundary in Spokane County, but we don't have an urban growth boundary in North Idaho. So that's acted as something of a relief valve for housing in this market. The housing needs that we have in general are being unmet. We have more people looking for housing than we have available housing. So that's showing up in very low inventory and the price escalation that we're seeing. This has all been kind of really recognized in the housing action plan that was done for Spokane recently. And they've identified, the need to create more housing, increase housing inventory and availability is one of the primary action items that came out of that study. I do want to put a little face on this because I think sometimes you can talk about these numbers and they don't really mean very much. But we're working with a young family, mom and dad, 2 kids. Dad works in the landscape business, makes $17 an hour Mom takes care of the two kids. Daycare for the two kids costs more than what she'd be able to earn working. So she stays home with the kids. So we have a family, median family income. We have a family income for this family of $34,000. They were renting the ground floor of a house that was, they converted the house into 2 units. So there's an upstairs unit and downstairs unit. Their rent was $850 a month. The landlord told them that when the pandemic moratorium ends, he's going to have to raise their rent. He's raising the rent to $1,500. So this house is a terrible house in a terrible neighborhood. The children that are living in this house have no children in the neighborhood. There's crime in the neighborhood. They don't have a school or a park that's within walking distance of where they live. And now they're faced with having to move into an even worse neighborhood and even worse house because they can't pay $1,500. $1,500 would be about 60% of their income. And you're burdened if you pay rent more than 30% of your income. So this is just a real life example of what's happening. And here's a family that is essentially being made homeless because of the escalating prices that are occurring in the market. So we have to look at ways to build more houses. And unfortunately, we have a regulatory system that is encouraging us to build big houses on big lots. And at the other end of the spectrum, we're building 100-unit apartment projects. And in between, we're building virtually nothing. And no one likes that. I don't like it. Builders and developers don't like it. Neighborhoods don't like it. Families don't like it. And we're not building the kind of housing in the middle. We're not building small houses on small lots. We're not building patio homes. We're not building townhouses. We're not building small condominiums. We're not building small multifamily units. And all of this is a result of a regulatory system that's outdated and is not designed to implement the comprehensive plan that we have that is focusing on infill development. This can kind of get a little bit wonky when you start talking about what the solutions are. And I don't want to overcomplicate this, but there are 3 things that I think are probably most important. And these are things that are easily done, can be done quickly, and don't take a lot of effort and don't take a lot of money. So the first one is that we need to change the dimensional standards that we have for housing. We need to be able to change those dimensional standards so they allow small houses and townhouses to be built on smaller lots. And our codes just simply don't allow that right now. So that's the first thing that I think we need to do. And we're not talking about increasing density. We're not talking about increasing building heights. We're not talking about putting multifamily and single family neighborhoods. We're just talking about the technical restrictions in the code that prevent small houses from being built on small lots, that prevent townhouses from being built. The second thing is that we need to have a pathway. We need to have a pathway for innovative housing developments. That's normally done with the process called a planned unit development. Kendall Yards, which is the project that we're developing near downtown, is being developed under a planned unit development that was approved prior to 2006. But in 2006, the city basically gutted the PUD ordinance. They changed it. They eliminated the flexibility that ordinance allowed. And since 2006, the PUD ordinance has been virtually unused. And so the kinds of things that you see in Kendall Yards, the mixture of townhouses, single family houses on small lots and so forth are being permitted by a PUD ordinance that we need to go back to. And so that's a second step that I think is really important, to trying to provide a pathway for innovative developments to occur. Thirdly, we need to encourage multifamily development around our centers and corridors. And the multifamily tax credit program, tax abatement program, has been very successful in incentivizing multifamily development. But that program is only available in low-income neighborhoods. It is not available around our centers on the South Hill. It's not available in our center locations on the north side. It's available in low-income neighborhoods. And the problem is that we already have enough multifamily in the low-income neighborhoods. We need to have housing equity spread evenly throughout the city. And I can tell you that that family that I'm talking about, if we're going to end poverty, then you have to have integrated housing. You have to have the ability for families to live in neighborhoods of opportunity, not just in low-income neighborhoods. And so it's very important that if we're going to incentivize multifamily, that we incentivize it around our centers, like, for example, Lincoln Heights, or the one at Grand, or the one in Indian Trail Road. So those are simple steps that can be taken. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, because this problem is one that's developed over 50 years. And if we're going to correct it, it's going to take incremental change over a lot of years. But those are some simple steps, I think, simple first steps that could be taken. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jim. Next, Councilwoman Candace Mountain.
Thanks so much. It's so great to be here with Peg. I know many of your members. Hello to all of them. And I also love this panel. I was one of the first to purchase from Jim Frank when he opened up the Kendall Yards. I think I was there day one. Super excited about it. And Chaz worked with me on the 5-mile pedestrian and bicycle plan, which was the first one we did in the city. And it's being used as a template now, rolling out to other communities. And of course, Amber sat next to me and was our council president pro tem, and she passed that hat off to me. So Amber and I have worked for years on projects collaboratively. I supported her with some initiatives in her community, and then she certainly has helped me out in my district as well. So thank you so much for bringing this panel together. We have lots of different perspectives to bring to you, but I thought I'd just touch on a few updates of what's happening in the city. I'm going to see if I can share my screen, see if I can do this. It'll just take me a minute because I have some new figures that you might be interested in. Let's see if I can do this. Yes. Okay, we'll try that. Stand by. Is that working yet? Can you see it? Can you see something that says urban development? Okay.
Yes.
So this is the urban development permit activity is hot, hot, hot. The developers are responding both in the multifam and single family permits. New single family residence is up 120%. The houses are coming. Don't know if it's enough, but lots of them are coming. Our construction valuations are also up over month to month and year to year. Here is our annual construction valuations. We are on pace. I'm going to scoot that over. Can you see that? Okay. We're on pace for almost a record year. These are total valuations. We have had some school funding that has added into that, but you can see coming out of the pandemic, we are on fire. Here's our annual construction valuations by size. And hopefully you can see that still doing quite well. What I like about this is we're holding the smaller, less than $1 million is still holding strong, which, you know, leans more toward some of the smaller projects. And then let's see if I can, whoops, I might have stopped it. There was a really good one I wanted to show you. Power BI just kicked me out. Well, that wasn't very nice. See if it'll come back up. Here's our single family map. I apologize, this is linked into the city. And so it's a little bit slow. Here's our single family permits coming on, showing you where they are all over the city. I find this kind of interesting. So we're seeing the building all over the place. And then let's see if I can switch the number. So we are on pace to be at least average or more for this year. We've had 282 so far, but the real story is in multifamily. And you can see here, we are at 510 units, one of our best years ever. So multifamily is taking off, and we were down to somewhere under 1% for all of the both single family and multifamily. So
your slides have not changed on the screen.
ever? Okay.
Well, you're still back at construction valuation.
Oh dear. Okay. Let me see if I can get this to work. Thank you for telling me that. This is public and private. Is it changing now?
Okay. Yes,
There's
now it's working.
Thank you. This is your single family residential permits. I'm a little rusty at this, you guys. Usually I have a lot of helpers. Here's your multifamily. Is that better to see that? The 510.
Mhm.
Okay. Really doing great. And then here's some of our bigger projects. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing that because I kind of messed that up anyway. But I wanted to just mention that we possibly have seen a crest. I'm not saying it's still not a bad situation, but I did check the recent realtor data, and our inventory is now a 24-day supply. At its worst, it was a 10-day supply during COVID, and it just keeps growing, that supply. So listings are up, and so is the prices, of course, but actually prices, the closings were actually down a little bit. And my husband's a realtor, and what he's seeing is a softening in prices. More, you're not seeing 30 people trying to get a house. You're actually seeing some price reductions. But again, we may not be out of this yet. So a couple of things I wanted to mention. Loved hearing the support for centers and corridors and neighborhood planning. It is smart growth to do that. And I was thinking about those of you who are on PEG, like, what could I do to help this? And I know a lot of you are supportive of working on climate change issues too. Here's what you can do. We have neighborhood plans in the city. And even if you are in the county, you could support the neighborhood planning effort closest to you, to your closest city neighborhood. You could attend those meetings. You could connect with those neighborhood plans and support the changes that need to be made inside those neighborhoods. I'm going to give you an example. We worked on an overall plan for Shadle Center. Shadle Center has all the goodies that you would want. It has a library, it has schools, it has a shopping center, and it has a bus line. But we didn't change the zoning on the ground, and we need to make it more compatible with mixed use in order to drive and support that neighborhood center. So even if you don't live next to a center, you could jump in with the neighborhood and help support them in fleshing out those neighborhood plans. I do want to talk briefly about Spokane Transit. Spokane Transit is really an untapped partner in growth and supporting housing. And what we're about to see is the opening of the city line, which will connect from Spokane Community College into downtown through the U District and Browns Addition. Those nodes along that line have tremendous opportunity for development. And our planners are getting to work on creating nodes within 6 blocks of those for higher density housing. That's part one. Part two is the Division Corridor. We are putting in for another major grant with FTA, the Federal Transportation Association, to get a north-south corridor to intersect with our east-west center line. And as traffic is going to potentially move off of the North Spokane auto corridor, we're going to have this tremendous opportunity along Division Street to identify nodes where those transit stops are going to be, and have all the zoning in place, really, to do some tremendous things for multifamily and walkable to your transportation. Now, yes, housing is very expensive, but the second most weighty thing in a family is transportation costs. And if you can have the opportunity for people to cut down those transportation costs and site themselves near reliable transportation that is going to come every 7 or 10 minutes, then now you've got something really working for you. So I'm very excited about that. And we are putting in for grants to make that happen for the city. And that is on the MFTA area. So I see huge opportunities, and we need support for those things too. Very worried about Northtown. I don't know if any of you have been to Northtown lately, but it's looking a little bleak. Northtown is one of our huge tax generators for the city. And that is a center now. We recently designated it as a center, another project you could jump in and help us with. We need to design mixed use around that shopping center to help get it through the metamorphosis that it has to get through in order to survive and to make a real vibrant area for folks. Again, it's on that high frequency bus line. And then finally, I think I'll just mention this because I find it interesting. My neighborhood, actually I have 10 neighborhoods in my district. My district has a lot of single women in it on both ends of the age spectrum. I have a lot of young moms who are single trying to make ends meet. And I have a lot of single ladies who have lost their husbands or are divorced, and they're living in homes that they can hardly keep up, and really they don't have any place to go. And they haven't done a plan for their next transition and really are having a tough time. And so this is something that I'm seeing sociologically that could, if we had some assistance with folks, both getting into better housing or transitioning to age appropriate housing, I think we could free up some of these units that would be very helpful for all those people who are trying to, sort of upsize. I was astounded when I found out a few years ago that Spokane was named the divorce capital of the United States. 16% of the folks who are adult age in Spokane are divorced. I said, Spokane, how could that be? Well, apparently poverty is a big piece of it because people who are in poverty don't have insurance, and they don't seek counseling, and they don't try to repair those relationships. And I know that's a very upstream piece of this housing crisis, but I think it's an important component. I'm especially concerned about women who make less money than men on average. And when it comes to Social Security in particular, they just don't have the means to have choices for their housing. So I look forward to your questions, and I hope that's been helpful.
Great, thank you. Next, Chaz Bates.
Awesome. Well, good evening, and thank you for being here. And like Candace, I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen. I have a PowerPoint, and I'm assuming it's a little bit different than normal. All right, try that again. All right, I'm assuming people are seeing it. I can't see anybody, so a verbal acknowledgement, perhaps.
Yes.
All right, sorry. I was like, I lost everybody. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Peg, for inviting me. I feel honored and privileged to be here. I feel honored and privileged to be a part of this panel. These are some amazing people that we have with us tonight. As Chris mentioned, I work for the City of Spokane Valley as a senior planner, and as an alternate to Jim, I am going to get a little bit wonky here because I'm a senior planner. I get to do things like that. I don't have to be in charge of stuff. I do want to say everything that I'm saying tonight is on my own. This doesn't necessarily represent what the Valley is doing, but it has its nexus and related to the work I did with the Housing Action Plan. And I promise I'll be pretty fast with this. Just to kind of set the stage and set the page, I just don't know. This stuff is really familiar to urban planners and probably our elected officials and anybody who's in housing. But in 2019, the legislature passed and gross second substitute House Bill 1923. That made some pretty substantial changes throughout the Growth Management Act. And one of the things it did was encourage the increased residential capacity and affordability. And it kind of laid out two paths to this. It had kind of either cities could adopt a host of regulatory mechanisms, or they can adopt a housing action plan. And it also, one of the amendments made that are related to housing action plans are a housing needs analysis, which has become part of state requirements. So as we progress and people go through their periodic updates and with the GMA, they're going to have to adhere to these kind of housing needs analysis. And what these analysis do is basically identify the housing needs that we need for the next 20 years by income segment. So it's pretty helpful. At least it is for us as a city. I'm trying not to talk as a city employee, but it's helpful for us to kind of know the targets that we have to achieve. This is kind of an interesting slide. I just kind of pulled this real briefly. It's not anything that people are not familiar with, but it's housing construction and lagging construction. As you can see, just from the 1960s to 2020, we've kind of progressively trended downwards in terms of new homes built per 100,000 people. This slide is actually for the state of Idaho. And I was too crunched for time to actually pull anything for the city of Spokane or Spokane Valley. But I've seen similar kind of trend lines across the nation and across different communities. And so it's kind of, we call it a housing crisis, but it's been a slow crisis coming, I think. This talks a little bit about Jim. He was mentioning housing affordability. When we talk about affordability, I'm gonna take a narrow definition tonight. I'm talking about how the state defines affordability in RCW 3678030. It's basically no more than 30% of your income. And then further defined for rental housing, those are for rental housing for people, 60% of the median housing income. So if they're earning 60% of the annual median income for renters and they're paying more than 30%, it's unaffordable. For owner-occupied housing, that number kind of bumps up to 80%. And part of the reason for that is because it becomes a little bit more stable. Those price increases aren't as noticed in terms of mortgage payments. And you can kind of see here, and maybe you can't see my cursor, but maybe you can. I'm just going to actually go to the next slide. When you kind of pin that down even further in our region, these numbers on this little house chart thing are actually from our housing action plan in Spokane Valley. And so what that means for a renter is that or an owner, for a renter, it's $815 a month. So you're earning a little over $32,600 a month, a year, for annual median income. And for owners, it's a little more than $52,000 per year, or you're going to be paying about $1,300. And Jim mentioned this is kind of the middle housing, this area of duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, cottage developments, townhouses, and small lot single family development. I'm going to move now to my ideas, or the ideas. I guess these are not my ideas. I mean, these ideas are kind of abundant and they're going to sound a little bit familiar from what you've already heard. Allow more housing types in more zones. It's cottages, townhomes, and triplexes. As Jim mentioned, there's many cities across the nation and in our area that kind of limit the amount of types of housing we allow in our zones. Wide swaths of our cities are devoted to primarily large lot single family zones. Where it might be applicable is in areas that have larger vacant properties, neighborhoods that might be below the maximum density that are currently allowed by the zoning code, or in compact neighborhoods where we kind of want to create that sense of place. And you'll probably hear this again and again, but near transit and amenities. As Candace mentioned, it's important to kind of consider that transportation cost is not included in that 30%. So if we can look at offsetting some of that cost for some folks, that kind of helps them save money, helps them get into a house and perhaps kind of progress up the ladder of home ownership. This is kind of a random assortment of stuff. So provide fee waivers for affordable housing. So this would be applicable to all zones that allow housing. So essentially what we would be doing is we'd be discounting the fees that we would charge builders to build housing that was affordable. This can't do it on its own, so it needs to be paired with other financial incentives or regulatory incentives such as density bonuses. But we need to also make sure that these houses remain affordable over time and that we target the income brackets that we need in our community. Again, this is based on kind of our housing needs assessment because we'll know what that number is from now going into the future. Reducing minimum lot sizes. As mentioned, large lots, more land costs more money. You tend to build a bigger house and get more return on your investment. We reduce the lot sizes and putting it within walking distance of transit and other amenities such as parks. You don't need as much yard when you're near a park. And you might not need a car again if you're in an area that is walkable and it has transit. You might want to do this in areas where residential zones that can be subdivided. So in often many cities, lots are bigger than the minimum lot size requires, and or they're just at that verge, and you could kind of reduce that minimum lot size. And finally, it provides kind of a flexibility in areas that are difficult to develop. Many communities, Spokane Valley in particular, kind of has a very suburban development pattern, which created like long, narrow lots and making it difficult to kind of develop. So reducing the minimum lot sizes allows greater flexibility to be able to infill in areas that are supported by infrastructure. And you heard Jim mention this, adopt a multifamily tax exemption. I would take it a step further. And if we're going to, encourage affordable housing as defined by state law, we adopt the 12-year program for affordable housing. And what the difference there is that a certain percentage of those housing units in that multifamily development will be required to be affordable and meet the affordable housing targets. They need to be in areas that make financial sense. You can see to the right-hand side of this is an analysis that we did for Spokane Valley, kind of talks a little bit about the land prices to what our current regulations allow. So as you see, we increase density and add the incentive. We kind of increase the profitability and the more likelihood that development will happen. In areas that lack multifamily housing, again, this is kind of opening up the outside where they may traditionally been allowed and where they might be well suited, like the Grand Center. Again, in areas that are supported by infrastructure, transit, amenities, and jobs. And again, offsetting the cost of needing to own 2 cars or even a car if it's really accessible, and put it in proximity to jobs. Likely need to pair this with other incentives like density and fee reductions, but I think it could be done. And I kind of just want to conclude here that there's no silver bullet, I think, to providing more affordable homes. It is a problem that's been kind of in process for a long time. And I think we need to also look at balancing the needs of the community vision with the need for change. As a planner, as a consultant, a number of times have heard the challenges that it requires to increase density, reduce lot sizes, reduce dimensional standards. All those things typically will get significant pushback from your neighbors and my neighbors. And so we just need to be more conscious of that and recognizing that if we're going to provide housing for everybody, we got to make a little bit of room. And finally, I started with a very narrow definition of affordability. I do think that providing more housing is necessary to meet housing for all income segments, not just state-defined affordability. And I kind of flew through that. So that's it. I'm going to stop my screen share, I think.
Okay, thank you, Chaz. And now, Amber, if you'd like to have a few words.
Thank you. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and participate in this forum. So thank you for inviting me. As Chris mentioned earlier, I sat on the city council for 8 years, worked on a lot of different housing strategies, including East Sprague redevelopment work, which did include some housing work with Chris at the time, and then also working on the Hamilton Corridor form-based code, the first form-based code in the city. I'm going to mention that a little bit, but I do have some slides. I have kind of three ideas with a part A and a part B. So that's how I get to my four ideas. So let me share my screen. And some of the points, when I go last here, a lot of the points have been covered by my esteemed panelist here. So I can kind of hit the highlights and maybe hit some things that haven't been already covered. So I guess I start with some guiding philosophy or principles, and some of you have covered this in previous comments, but obviously the demand for homes is greater than the supply right now. We need a diversity of housing options. My perspective is too, we also need to subsidize housing at a greater rate than we are today to meet the needs of renters and homeowners of different income levels. As mentioned, I really believe strongly, and there's a lot of data to back this up, that if we want to have, a strong economy and sustainability, and especially of our utility systems and infrastructure, we need to really tie our transit plans and our utility and street plans to our housing strategies. They're obviously connected cost, housing and transportation for residents. So important to think about that when we are thinking about where we place housing. And then again, I think there is still a lot of room in the urban growth area. It's always something to look at with our UGA, where we could build or change within that area. There is a lot of areas still, even in the city of Spokane, that can be further developed and infilled if we can look at some of these things, like addressing some of the zoning around missing middle and other strategies. So I wanted to highlight, as Candace mentioned, a couple different populations of concern. And Jim, you told the story of that young family. My housing populations of concern are low income right now with the rising rents, low income seniors and low income families, especially the single parent families that Councilmember Mumm mentioned. They're a huge portion. I work out of the Northeast Community Center now. I work on a project called The Zone. We're a partnership of schools, residents, and organizations generating hope and opportunity through collective action. And we just did a survey on rents and rising rents, and I'll show you some of that data later on here in my presentation. But about over 50% of women-headed households in the Northeast neighborhoods of Spokane, more or less Council District 1, live below the poverty line. There are a lot of single-parent households, women-headed households. So there's a real concern right now with the rising rents because they don't have a lot of income. Their income is not rising. And if they're on a fixed income like seniors, it's becoming really challenging. And then the other housing population of concern, I think, is what we call ALICE families. That's a term that United Way coined probably 10 years ago. And these are working families that have at least one or two incomes in the household, like Jim was describing. They sometimes make too much to be eligible for housing subsidies, like a Section 8 voucher. But yet, with the rising costs of rent, they may need some subsidy to be able to stay housed. And then also, if they want to move from a renter to a homeowner, there's a real concern right now that that's not an option for these families. So my first strategy is really, this is a little picture kind of the missing middle types of housing that Chaz talked about. There's definitely an opportunity for that missing middle and allowing for that to happen, that infill, that different conversions, duplexes, triplexes. I think that we can definitely do that in different ways. And Candace mentioned also increasing the land area of centers and corridors. It was frustrating for me when I saw the lovely Monroe Street corridor investments going in, and yet the center is only like 2 parcels or 3 parcels off of Monroe Street. We need to greatly expand those centers and corridors so that we can develop all sorts of commercial and residential in those areas. I mentioned the form-based code. That's kind of an interesting way to go about. Form-based code is around, doesn't matter what you do in the unit, doesn't matter if it's commercial, residential, mixture of uses. The idea is that it just meets the form or the design of the street. And I think that's really important to residents. I think that there are a lot of neighborhoods that are willing to see this infill happen and these different types of housing be allowed, as long as there's an orientation to the street. There's a design that still looks and feels like that traditional street. I was walking home today through the Northeast neighborhood, and homes are developed at a certain angle. You have your windows, you have your front doorstep. Can we develop some of these different types of properties in a way that still allows for that sense of place and that strong design in a neighborhood, I think we can. So that's something to work on as a community. So number two, funding new affordable housing. And this isn't, it's not an area of expertise for me, but I know we need more funds available. Jim mentioned working with a lot of affordable housing, either nonprofits or for-profits. We need more state support. We need more federal support. We need more funds available to match and mix and match and pay for that affordable housing. There was a good guest opinion today in the Spokesman. This is on October 5th by Jonathan Mallahan, talking about some of those specific, state and federal matching strategies. I also think that there's some movement in Spokane around shared equity models for homeowners. And that is figuring out how people can get into homes and purchase homes and keep them affordable for your middle income families. So there's some different strategies. Obviously Habitat has a strategy, which is sweat equity goes into the property to make it more affordable for a first-time home buyer to get into that property. So I would like us to, explore and support those strategies in Spokane. And then I think this area we haven't really touched on that much, but how do we keep our current housing affordable when we see these rental costs going up? Yes, we can update some of our zoning and our codes. Yes, we can maybe get some more state and federal dollars to build more affordable housing, but that is going to take us some time. It will take time to develop those strategies. So what do we do in the next 3 to 5 years so families can stay affordably housed, especially our working families that are like the lifeblood of our local economy? We need to have affordable housing for those people, for the landscaper that Jim talked about. We need landscapers in Spokane. We can't lose those families in that workforce. So that workforce housing is really, a concern. So this is some data that the zone at the Northeast Community Center, we did a survey. We got about 200 respondents across Spokane. We focused on the Northeast area. So the majority were in the Northeast part of Spokane, but it's not news to anyone that, there's been major rental increases. The majority of respondents were really concerned about being able to stay in their home and finding something they can afford in Spokane. There's a lot of hopelessness. 78% of those that responded were feeling very worried about their housing future. So a couple ideas that I have been talking about or contemplating when I was coming off of city council was maybe we need to create our own local housing voucher system. Only, the Section 8 voucher program, which is basically a subsidy that helps people pay their rent. Only 1 out of 4 households nationwide who are eligible receive a Section 8 voucher. And so a lot of communities have created their own local voucher programs to help subsidize and keep people housed. So that's one thing we could consider with our city county ARPA dollars and any other eligible housing dollars that are flowing, through our community. Tacoma has a program and it's managed by the Tacoma Housing Authority. It could be managed by the Spokane Housing Authority. And full disclosure, I'm on the Housing Authority board, but I'm speaking totally on my own. And none of my ideas here are representative of the Housing Authority board. Also, I think I'm concerned, I've heard about a lot of homeowners that have a lot of aging housing stock here in Spokane, low to middle income homeowners, and they're selling because they're getting these cash offers they can't afford to upkeep. And the maintenance, a new roof, a new boiler, a new, heating system. So, one thing that I tried to work on at City Hall, but we didn't have a lot of eligible funding at the time, was building upon our CDBG, our Community Development Block Grant home maintenance program, helping people with no interest or low interest loans to help maintain their properties so they can stay affordably housed. So I think we could use some of our ARPA dollars for that purpose to kind of create a no interest revolving loan program. So those are some ideas about how we could keep housing affordable as we develop over the next 3 to 5 years and implement maybe some of these other strategies. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank all the panelists. And I'd like to see if any of the panelists would like to comment on what anyone else said. And I'll throw out one thing that's sort of a tone of several questions that have come in, is that there's a great commonality here about, you know, the housing for this missing middle and the different housing types. What's the holdup? We've known this for a long time and nothing's happened, or it doesn't appear that very much at all has happened. What's the holdup? Why isn't it happening?
Chris, let me give you an example. We're developing a project on the south side of Spokane called Garden District. It's located on Southeast Boulevard and 29th. The project is located across the street from a park and ride lot. It's an STA park and ride lot. It's located walking distance to the Lincoln Heights Shopping Center. It's located on 29th Avenue, which is the new high-speed transit route that STA is planning for the south side. And this property is located directly adjacent to a center location. But the city has what they call a lot size transition rule. That if you're in a single family neighborhood and there's large lots around you, then you're forced to build large lots. You can't build small ones, even though they're consistent with the zoning. So we were wanting to develop some small cottage homes in this project, and we would have been able to do 60 small cottage lots, but we needed to be able to build them on 3,000 and 4,000 square foot lots. But the lot size transition rule in the city forced us into 7,500 square foot lots. So we're, instead of building 60 cottages that might have been priced at around 300,000, we're forced to build 30 houses priced at 700,000. So that's a direct result of a outdated rule that exists in the city of Spokane. That's just simply a barrier to doing the kind of housing that we need to do. And there's no reason for this rule. This rule does so much harm. It tells the people that live in our community that small lots in your neighborhood are a bad thing. And we, the city, are here to protect you, to make sure that small lots are not going to be developed in your neighborhood. I believe that this is nothing more than modern day redlining. That's all it is. And it's those kind of technical requirements in the code. And that lot size transition rule, there's no way to get out of it. You can't even vary it if you do a PUD. So it's a barrier, and it's those kinds of barriers that need to be removed.
Any other comments on this? What does everybody else think?
I think I just need to clarify a little bit about the definition of redlining. I have a lot of folks on my street who are people of color, and I would have more than average cost of a home. And so I don't necessarily disagree that we have to look at that, but I think we have to be pretty clear that redlining was about keeping certain people of color out. And I wouldn't think that our current codes have any of that going on now. I would like to think that. And if there is, please call them to my attention. But I do want to support what Jim was saying, in that we have some things that need to be looked at, because now we're one of the most popular places in the country to come to, right? So we have a basket of things. The list that the council has been trying to get done for a tremendous amount of time has been backlogged, not just because of COVID, but because there just wasn't enough staff to process the public process that we need to go through. And we have finally broken a log jam with the mayor's office to hire and contract out this work. And that's the only way we're going to get it done, because we have been without a planning director in the city for over 3 years. And I just heard the recent efforts to recruit for a planning director have just been scrapped again. So we have to go back out for a 4th time, which is very difficult to recruit for a planning director. Now, yes, that is just one person, and the acting person who's certainly qualified is in there, but we've kind of held off on hiring other planners. And it's just a well-known fact, we're short. And so we can't process and keep up with the demand and the growth needs and all the different types of housing. And the fact that now we're a remote destination for the workforce out of Seattle and Portland. So I'm cheering on reform. And I think we've got the mayor bought into contracting out. So I'm hoping some of the things that Jim Frank is talking about, we can finally get processed.
Yeah, and I think I might just want to maybe add on, or at least maybe meld these two things together. I think, as a planner who puts these kind of codes and ordinances together, I mean, they're universally based on public process that we use to engage the public, and the people who have the opportunity and time and commitment to come in and participate will typically have a vested interest in preserving their kind of most valuable asset. And then there's a lot of public resistance, I think, to making those changes. And it seems really simple, and it is. But I think I would call upon our audience that I can't see other than our panelists here to be the people and the voice that kind of brings that forward and support the change that's needed. Because, it's, from my perspective anyways, I mean, it's not done in a vacuum. It's all based on the will of the people and the community vision that's been laid out in the comprehensive plan.
Here's a question that did come in. And it deals with this kind of pushback. Can a property owner's interest be protected while also taking these steps to improve affordability? Is there a built-in conflict there, or can both things happen?
I think both things can happen. I mean, I do. And I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. I think it is people, and myself included, are resistant to change. There's something a little bit sometimes scary about the unknown. And I think, I guess that's all I got. I mean, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think you can have both.
Oh, and Chaz, I agree with you. I mean, in my case of the Garden District project, that people that live in that neighborhood surrounding the Lincoln Heights neighborhood, the Lincoln Heights Neighborhood Council, fully supported our desire to build smaller homes there. That was fully supported by the neighborhood. But we were prevented from doing that by the city development code. And I'm convinced in the 30 years that I've been in housing that people can and will understand these issues if they're educated, if an effort is made to educate them. But when you put things like a transition lot rule in a code, you're telling people the exact opposite. You're telling them that that's a very bad thing for their neighborhood, that economic diversity in your neighborhood is not a good thing, and therefore we're protecting you from it. That's exactly what a code section like that does. That's the message that it sends. And that's the thing that needs to end. You're never going to hope to change the public's opinion when you misinform them in that way.
I wanted to, on a related note, Jim, you had mentioned earlier trying to support affordable housing throughout Spokane and having incentives for that. And I think that's really important. We've traditionally just placed affordable housing in certain areas, and those have been the traditionally, redlined areas that still tend to be 100 years after redlining in Spokane, where there's concentrated people of color and poverty. And so we need to be, our comprehensive plan states that we need to be creating options in every neighborhood for all different income levels. That's our big vision. Now we need to get into these little pieces, right? And peel them away and get rid of some of these pieces that are prohibiting that, and then find ways to incentivize it. The reality is it's going to be more expensive to build affordable housing in a higher, in a lot that's a higher valued lot. So how do we subsidize? What is the subsidy? How do we work with that? Is there city-owned land that we can use? How do we put those pieces together so that we can build? The Housing Authority is going to be building more units in the next 3 years because we sold our single family units and in order to build more units of affordable housing throughout Spokane. And we'll be looking at those opportunity neighborhoods.
I mean, Amber, I think that if you're allowed to build to the density in the single family zone, if you're allowed to build to 10 units an acre, even though that acre might cost a little bit more on the South Hill than it does in West Central, if you can get a little bit more density on it, then you can make up on a per unit basis for that difference in price. The problem isn't the land cost, it's the ability to build the middle income, the middle density housing. The problem is you can't do it. And if you were able to do it, then you can make the land price work. So the challenge here is to create an environment where some housing is permitted other than a big house on a big lot or a 100-unit apartment project. There's nothing in between, literally nothing, except in places like Kendall Yards, where we got the deviations that I'm talking about from these code sections. We were able to get them in Kendall Yards. So the kind of things that you see in Kendall Yards, that's the kind of middle density housing that you can have. And that's what it can look like. But you have to allow that everywhere. And we've taken away every pathway to make that happen. And I'll tell you, if we don't admit that we've done that, then we're never going to fix this problem. If all we're going to do is pretend that there's good, that we can't do it for some reason or another, then we're never going to get it done. I mean, even on the form that Candace showed, that table of building permits, in 2007, there were 702 single family permits. That's what I read from that chart. In 2020, if that was the last one on there, if that was 2020, there were 280. So you can say that things are, we're really growing. Look, we have 280 permits. The trouble is 15 years ago, you had 702. That's the problem. We are not building houses. And that has to change. And it has to change in a way that allows us to build this middle density. And we don't need to build more than 10 units an acre. That's permitted in the residential single family zone. But you need to be able to build smaller houses on smaller lots. You have to be able to build townhouses. And you have to get rid of these barriers, and they're not complicated. This isn't something that you have to hire some outside consultant to do. This is pretty simple stuff. It's frustrating to me, honestly, that we're where we are, that we know what the problem is. We're just afraid to take the actions that we need to take.
Jim, when we did the form-based code on Hamilton Corridor, we allowed for like the townhomes that you're talking about. You could build those today on Mission, where you have kind of some dilapidated older housing, Mission and Hamilton area. It's right on the central city line. It's amazing. It's like literally going to be right next to a station. How do you incentivize those property owners to do that? Because it's allowed today. So what is holding back, do you think, some landowners or developers from doing that today?
Well, I mean, first of all, you're seeing some of it happen on Hamilton. I mean, there's 2 or 3 townhouse projects being developed on Hamilton. I mean, one's under construction right now. One was done a couple years ago. I mean, I see them happening, but you know, there's not a tremendous amount of vacant parcels. So these changes that we're talking about, they take time to implement. It takes time to get permitted. It takes time to do the construction, get your financing, accumulate the land, and so forth. So I think you're seeing some things on Hamilton that are a result of the work that was done. But there's other places that there is no pathway at all to do that. Look, we've had centers and corridors planned for more than 15 years. There's not one single corridor. There's not one single center that's developed the way we envisioned in the comp plan. And so it's not a matter of just adding more land to centers. We have to understand, why are those centers not developing? And it's going to come down to, you know, there's going to be some development restrictions that are preventing that, but you have to understand what those are. And the frustrating thing to me is that you could ask the planning department today, why isn't it happening? And they won't be able to tell you. And that's a problem. If you don't understand, if you have a vision of accomplishing something and you don't understand why it's not happening after 15 years, that's a problem.
Go ahead, Candace.
So let's talk about the centers that are working. And I just want to make it clear, my solution was not just to add more land to a center. We need, as a city, to invest in these centers. And we picked targeted ones. And I can tell you which ones they were when we had leadership at City Hall that understood that the city needed to invest to support the small businesses and provide the incentives to build out the frontage of the streets. Let's talk about Perry District. Have we seen a turnaround there? Yes, that was a pilot center. Let's talk about East Sprague. I don't know if you've been out there. Major city investment and support from the businesses. We won a Smart Growth Award for the design of that center. And we had full support from both the mayor's side and the council side to invest in infrastructure there. It's continuing to build out. It has not had the housing that we would like yet, but that goes to more center planning that needs to happen to increase the area and have it be focused growth. The other ones I could call out to you that you are familiar with, we did do some work on Nevada, and I think we've seen, or the Hamilton corridor, I think we've seen some fruits of that labor. And now we're finally seeing the fruits of the labor on North Monroe corridor. Absolutely, we started a 2.0 project for housing on both sides because of the narrow strip that was already there. We knew we needed to do it. And quite frankly, the mayor shut it down and said, no, we're not doing that because of the staffing issue. We do have a public process. Jim knows all about this. He participates in it. He's well aware of our public process that's required. And it was the failure of leadership and I will point the finger at it, in the mayor's office that didn't understand that developing these business centers was key to the thriving walkability that we needed to have to support our small businesses. And they're finally coming around to understanding because we can show that it's worked in the other areas that we did kick off and invest. So there are some things that we need to do to these centers. And I have said that from the very beginning. Council we can fund all these things, but if the mayor doesn't implement it, it doesn't happen. We are being heard. The mayor is listening to this, and there's lots of voices talking about the importance of planning and long-range planning in order to implement it. Jim mentioned our housing action plan that we put together, but that to me, it's not a failure of centers and corridors. It's a failure to implement the centers and corridors. And good planners who do this business know that it can be done. It's going to take an investment from the city to flesh it out. And I'm hoping with some of the ARPA dollars, we're going to be able to do this.
I mean, Candace, this is not a problem that you can blame on the current mayor. The centers and corridors problem goes back 15 years.
Oh no, I'll be clear. Not just this mayor, multiple mayors. We had so many mayors, and we had so many planning directors. So no, it's not just this mayor.
I mean, Candace, that there has been commercial development in the centers. Everybody, I think, recognizes that. What there hasn't been is residential development in the centers. And that's true of South Perry, it's true of East Sprague, it's true of every single one of them. I mean, I've been trying to help a landowner that owns the McKinley School, trying to find a pathway for putting residential units in that school and on the land surrounding the school. It's been a war for him for 3 years, trying to find a pathway to put residential development on land that's a half a block off of the commercial corridor. And all of this is opposition from staff and from development regulations that are just prohibitive. And this isn't a question of landowners not wanting to do it. There has to be a pathway for them to do it. And Candace, I'm going to be very direct. If you don't help provide a pathway for this to happen, it's not going to happen.
I know, Jim, you and I've talked about this a lot. We agree 90% of the time. And I live at City Hall. So I'm going to, and Amber, if you want to weigh in here on how difficult this is to get through, she's lived through it with me. And I'm telling you, we're all about smart growth and making it happen, and increasing housing choices. And that's why you get elected, is because you work on these things. So we're doing good work. We are making progress. I know it's not fast enough, and we're all frustrated.
So what can citizens do to help this move along? We've got, I don't know how many people we have. We have a fair number of people listening. What can they do to help motivate the city, the administration, the decision makers to move in this direction?
Call on chat.
Any?
I'd like to hear from Chaz. He's on the
Sure,
other
Chaz,
side.
What can citizens do? I think I'm a dad of a 5-year-old. My time that I'm not at work, I'm spent making dinner and doing chores. I mean, I'm lucky to get away to do this, which is awesome. I appreciate it. But participation's hard. It's hard to get people that are not your normal people coming to meetings and participating and voicing their concerns. And again, Jim, I just want to say, I mean, that's what generally drives that conversation. I mean, I've done these things all over the state and nation, and the public drives that process. And if the public comes out and says they want to change the dimensional standards, they want to see smaller lots, it can happen. And I know staff, and we will propose it, and it just meets a ton of resistance. And where that resistance comes from, I'm not, other than saying, I don't want to blame the public. It's not the public's fault. I mean, there's just a sense, a fear of change. And I think there is a point to be made that, I mean, showing them that, Kindle Yards is a good example of what we can't do under our existing regulations. And if you allow us to make this change, it can happen. And then we're faced with the question of like, well, how can you guarantee that that's going to happen? And that's the problem in a nutshell, is that the flexibility that's required to get developers to do stuff requires people to be comfortable with not knowing what to expect. I don't know. So come and participate as much as you can.
And I think there's one of the challenges that I've seen is that you sometimes there's a magical moment and you've got to grab it and run with it. And you can't necessarily, the city had this neighborhood planning process, and all the neighborhoods had to wait in line and do their planning. And it felt like sometimes there was a magical opportunity, like this Logan neighborhood. The Logan neighborhood stood up and said, we want to expand our center. We want bigger density. Whoa, like grab that, city, and run with it. But it was like pulling teeth at the time to get the city staff to put it on their priority list. So like Chief Gary neighborhood had a planning process 5 years ago, and they discussed building out and changing the zoning along Mission to support the Central City Line rapid transit. And then we just kind of like went, okay, that plan's done, on the shelf. And I'm like, oh my God, this is the moment to go start implementing that and changing that zoning and working with the neighborhood, because they're engaged. They just spent 6 months to a year working on this process. Then let's do it. So I think part of it is this kind of waiting around and making sure there's some sort of, well, we got to wait for this neighborhood. When we have a time and we have an opportunity, we need to grab it. But as Candace is saying, there's a long list, I know, at the city of like 20 different things that need to be updated, right? In the codes and in the zoning. And it's like, how we've got to have some leadership coming together and saying, okay, these are going to be the most impactful that we can start to work on. And Chaz, to your point, there have, I mean, going and looking at some of the cottage housing that Jim has developed in Kendall Yards, right? Like, and there's been some out in the valley too, right? So we have more examples now that hopefully we can maybe show folks so they can actually see it with their own eyes. I would agree that a while back, there really wasn't a lot of examples that people could grab onto, but maybe we can start to show those and people can start to see what that would really look like and go, oh, this is attractive. This is something that I just think in the next year, we're going to have people really getting together and saying, I can't afford to live here anymore. And it's come to a tipping point. So the challenge is putting the resources together to make it happen. And I'm glad that the city is looking at contracting out maybe some of these updates to the codes and stuff, because it just needs to happen. And we can't wait around for a planning director and to hire more planners. If that's not what's going to happen, I mean, I'm sure Chaz, you would love to have more planners out in the valley too, right? We need to come up with strategies to move things forward. And I think sometimes we start with the low hanging fruit. Maybe we need to start with the middle hanging fruit and really do something that's going to have a greater impact faster. So that's just my perspective.
I just
Sure.
think opportunities. I think ARPA funds are a huge opportunity for us. We have $81 million in the city.
Plus
Chaz,
100 at the county.
and then we also have STA received some funds. I know the Valley received some funds. And to me, how we spend these funds are critical to this tipping point that we're talking about and where we invest them. I'm more of a long range plan type of a gal. I like investing in things that I know are going to give us a return on investment year after year after year. So I'm less of a program person. So I saw some things in there. Well, let's give, I don't know, more vouchers, or let's do, some kind of help with first time home buyers. And I'm open to that, but I'm more interested in some of these long-term returns on investment. And so if we need to, or could use it for a contract to redo our MFTE and have that more aligned with our centers and corridors, so it's not just with the low income as it has been in the past, I think that is something that could easily be contracted out. Some of those other things that have more sweeping incentives to it, and maybe some of these big center plans, again, could be contracted out. You still engage the neighborhood, but you have someone who's not on city staff. City staff supervises, but they don't have to do all the work. And that kind of work could really be done anywhere around the country right now, especially with this remote ability. So I think, to your point, what can we do? You can send any ideas. I've seen great ones in the column and put those ideas into an ARPA. It's a 1-page document that's coming out, a request for ARPA funding toward $81 million, plus all this other money that could come about. We could have a regional solution perhaps here. So I think that's a big financial opportunity for us. If we don't have the staff, we certainly have the money, and we can go find the people to do the work.
Okay, there are a number of questions coming in from the audience, and I want to be able to respond to at least a couple of them before our time is up. In one area, several questions regard increasing home ownership. We are a community countywide that's maybe 60% homeowners and 40% renters. But when you get into the low income neighborhoods, it's reversed. And so how can we make home ownership more accessible to low and even middle income people? We see more and more people can't afford our housing prices these days.
Well, oh, go
Andrew.
ahead, Chaz, you go, then I'll follow up.
Well, I was just gonna say, I think actually Jim kind of stated it, and in some respect stated my thing, smaller lots and having more options for different types of housing, which, to Jim's point, I mean, require some additional modifications to our code. I mean, I think not everybody's gonna want or be able to initially afford that single family house on an independent detached lot, and so giving them a step in the right direction to be able to have a townhouse that they can own and then sell and then move on if they want to move on, is I think is the way to go.
What about the shared equity options that Amber mentioned? And I know, Jim, you're doing some stuff in your neighborhoods to do limited equity, or easy entry into some home ownership.
Yeah, I've been exploring that with just because I'm interested in this and what we could do better in Spokane. So there's been some work done by Habitat as well as by Community Frameworks with the city. I would like to start moving on that and piloting some of it. I think the challenge, they have some strategies they'd like to put into place where basically some of the equity, and maybe Jim, you understand this way better than I do, I'm sure. But some of the equity, if you were to purchase a home and then you were to sell it, you don't get to take all the equity with you. Some of it stays to keep that home affordable. And there's Community Frameworks has a plan. They're ready to implement it. They just need some startup funding. So maybe that's an opportunity, Candace, the ARPA funds. But Jim, what have you been exploring in that area?
Well, in West Central, we've been working with a small private developer who's been working with Habitat. And so they've been identifying single family homes when they come on the market. Then they've been acquiring them, fixing them up. And then the houses go to Habitat. Habitat gets a homeowner. The key here is that you have to basically buy down the price. So it used to be in West Central that, as little as 3 years ago, you could have found a house under $100,000. But today, you're probably not finding a house in West Central under $300,000. I mean, just think about that for a second. But so the private developer is buying the houses, he's fixing them up. The advantage of having the private developer buy the house and fix them up is that they don't have to deal with all the strings that are attached to using federal or state money or local money. So you don't have to worry about prevailing wages. You don't have to worry about the evergreen standards and those kinds of things. So it makes it far more efficient. And then he's selling the house to Habitat. And then Habitat, we're going to be making an application to the impact committee, which is using the TIF funds that can be used for housing in West Central. And I think their goal within the next few months is to make an application for about $500,000. And they believe that about $50,000 of subsidy support per house will enable that house then to be sold to a homeowner. And that subsidy basically comes in the form of essentially down payment assistance, so that you get the price of the house down to what can be afforded by someone making less than 80% of median income. And then they put a deed restriction on the property, and there's a formula with it that allows the homeowner to get the equity that's equivalent to what they would have gotten had in a typical mortgage situation. And because the house has been subsidized, let's just say a $300,000 house is subsidized down to $250,000. Well, there's from a market standpoint, there's $50,000 of equity there already. So if you let the homeowner buy that and flip the house immediately, they've just made $50,000 of equity. So you have to prevent that from happening. And you prevent that from happening by have a equity share formula. And so if they keep the house for 10 years, well, maybe they get all of the equity. But if they only keep it for 1 year, then maybe they only get 5% of the equity. And then the balance of the profit goes back to Habitat and it's put back into another home. So that's the idea of it. And I think it's a really good program because it's doing a lot of good things. First of all, it's allowing existing houses to be rehabilitated. It's putting homes that generally were rented. And one of the mistakes that was made in West Central is that they zoned a single family neighborhood multifamily. An entire neighborhood of single family homes was zoned multifamily. And so all of those homes then all of a sudden became rentals. And so a lot of the homes that are being purchased were rentals, and now they're being put back into home ownership. So that's a positive thing. And it's being done affordably. If you try to go to a new housing program using, say, low income tax credit or some of the other programs, it's costing $400,000 or $500,000 to build a new home unit using all of the federal money. Here, you may only be spending 1/10 of that to put a home into home ownership and keep it permanently affordable. That easement that's put on the property also requires that it be permanently affordable, meaning it can only be sold to a person making less than 80% of median income. So there's a lot of potential with that. It's not going to solve the problem because the problem is we're short 1,000 units a year. We're not short 10 units a year. But I do think that this program can be effective in home ownership as a home ownership program. It needs some subsidy money to make it work. And it's also an opportunity for public-private partnerships, nonprofits working together to find the most efficient solution. So
It was, it kind of got started out of the housing foreclosure challenges and trying to get those houses, from abandoned properties into good use. So I appreciate the work Habitat's doing with other partners on that.
You think that can be replicated in other neighborhoods, other areas of the city?
Oh yeah, they're looking in the Northeast area. That the challenge is they were doing pretty well till things got real tight and hot during COVID, and a lot of people were moving here, and it's tough for them to compete, right? For Habitat to purchase the home and then compete with the private market.
But I do think that's maybe where the ARP money can be beneficial. If you set up, say, a $10 million seed fund, and
that's what they need.
And that seed fund would be available because Habitat has to pay market price for the house, or if it's a private developer buying it and rehabbing it and then selling it to Habitat, that all has to be done at market rate. So that has to be subsidized. But if there was a seed fund of some kind that could be used to subsidize those costs, then I think it could be very effective. And I think it's more cost effective than most of the other programs. So, and so that's an idea, Candace, that a certain amount of the money could be set up a seed fund to help develop some of these programs.
And I worked with them to put in a request, like an earmark, to Senator Murray's office earlier this year, but that was before the ARPA, legislation passed, and those dollars have now trickled down to the local level. So I definitely think it's a huge opportunity because that's been the main barrier. Startup funds, just like when I was talking about the revolving loan fund, you got to start with something. And then, it can start to, reinvest in itself over time.
Okay, I got one final question here that's come in, and see where this leads us. Do any of you see any solutions for the very low income people who can afford, say, $600 to $800 a month for a small apartment and there's nothing out there that's affordable. What do they do? You know, the voucher list is what, a year out or 2 years out or something like that. How do we deal with the people who are not homeless yet, but at the very lowest rung of the income ladder? It's
Well,
not
that's
easy.
that was my idea to create maybe a local voucher program. Again, you could use ARPA funds and you could make it a 3-year program as a pilot. You're not going to be able to sustain it forever on the ARPA funds. And that's to your point, Councilmember Mum, like, you know, you don't want to start a program and not be able to continue to sustain it. But perhaps those dollars could offset, maybe there's other housing dollars that could offset that over time. I don't think there's an easy answer until we get more housing built. So that's why, you know, I proposed having a local, basically a local Section 8 program. And I need to learn more about what Tacoma uses as a funding source, if that's a tax or if it's coming out of other housing funds. But obviously they've been doing it for years, so there's something we can look to.
Mhm. I know Seattle has a housing levy, you know, that's a tax levy. Who knows whether would ever be the political will to pass that here.
Well, we do have 1590 funds, and we have been working with the legislature on a couple other mechanisms. I will just kind of point out that, you know, Spokane as a city entity, we are gearing up in a couple of areas that are actually something we don't have a lot of experience in. That is 24/7 homeless shelters. That was typically in the nonprofit sector. Housing, these kind of housing things, typically that was either nonprofit sector or the private market. So over the last decade or so, we've jumped into those realms and used, you know, general fund dollars in order to do it, and some pass through federal dollars. So coming to an agreement on how much, when, and where, what has happened is a lot of the 24/7, I don't really want to pull the homeless thing into this because that's a whole separate thing, but there's a little bit of a connection. Much of that has landed on the city of Spokane's doorstep. And there has not yet, just slightly, been any funds coming forward from any other cities or the county in order to support these efforts. It's starting to happen. We are working with some cities and the county to try to do that. But this is a regional problem because these folks are coming into our community, not just homeless, but also people trying to have high-speed internet so they can work remotely from all the small cities and towns around our region. And so when you talk to some of these small towns, they're actually seeing a loss or a stagnation of especially of young people who have moved into the city. So we kind of are the place to go, and the city of Spokane is sort of where everybody is focusing. And we're trying to embrace it as a community and work with our partners in order to determine how much should the city of Spokane slice of the pie be, and who else can come in and join and work with us. So I hope in the future you're seeing us do more regional partnerships on these things like housing and on the homelessness issues. So that's what I think the next generation of city leaders will be working on.
Any final comments? We're about at our time limit here of 8:30. We're go a little bit longer. Anything, Chaz? Any final comments?
Oh, call me out. The other people unmuted first. Come on, Chris.
You've been quiet for a while, so.
Well, you know, this is not necessarily my area of expertise by any means, and I certainly, you know, I know that there are other funds that are available, recording fee funds, AHA funds, and maybe that's Candace, you mentioned by 1598, but they're, you know, the county as a whole and the city of Spokane are collecting these funds per recording document fee, and that can be used for homelessness activities. But I think a parting note in terms of like the adjustments to the zoning codes and the codes and regulations that we have, again, I just firmly think, I mean, and we need your participation in this, at least from my perspective as a staff, not the staff of City of Spokane, but just a staff planner, is that we don't make these up in a void. And it's just, there's often a lot of pushback that we got either from our electeds or appointeds, or, community members who've had the most voice. And so if you want to see change, you have to kind of participate in that process and make it happen.
Great. Anyone else?
Well, I was just going to say, I appreciate Councilmember Mumm talking about the regional approach. And it's so important now more than ever as we're in this housing crisis. If we don't take action on some of these things upstream, we're going to be spending more and more money on the downstream homelessness issues. And that's what we're seeing. So it's hard to say we kind of have to work on both, but the more that we can invest upstream to address and some of the strategies we talked about tonight, then hopefully over time we can spend less, right, on the homeless shelter solutions, because we will have more housing stock and hopefully more supportive housing for those who really need it. But I just wanted to say thanks to everyone with the great comments and participation, really good comments in the chat, and appreciated the opportunity to be here.
Okay. Well, on behalf of the PEG board and membership, I want to thank all of you for spending your time with us tonight, and thank the audience members for sticking with us. It's an important topic. A video of this program will be on our website at www.pegnow.org in about 2 weeks. And in November, there will be a forum on the homeless issue, related but not the same. We don't know the exact date yet, but we'll publicize it here very shortly. So we hope people will join into that forum as well. And I just want to close personally saying, I think the idea of people getting involved, if we want these changes to happen, we have to be the ones to make them happen. So I would encourage everyone who's in the audience to tell your friends, tell everybody, get involved, and let's make the changes that will help us solve this affordability crisis. So again, thanks everyone, and have a good evening.